Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the extra bonus disc version of the April Board of Education meeting. Thank you for coming back to us, for those who were here last week, and we hope to have a successful meeting this evening. We're going to stand for the pledge, but I ask that after the Pledge of Allegiance, we just give a brief moment of silence to those who have succumbed to COVID-19. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America
and
to the republic
which it
for which
stands,
it stands,
one
nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice
for all. Thank you. We begin today's business with the budget information meeting. So Trish Rufo, please.
Okay. Thank you. I'll share my screen. Yeah, are you all seeing the
Yes.
the first? Okay.
Yes.
And you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, good evening and welcome to our third presentation of the 2021 budget. The first two meetings were focused on the expenditure plan, and tonight we're going to spend a little bit of time on the other side of the budget, which is the revenue plan. The date for the school budget vote is still not determined, and therefore all the other budget deadlines, such as the date for budget adoption and the budget hearing, have also are yet to be determined. Over the weekend, the New York State Budget Director suggested not for school districts not to adopt budgets until after May 15th, but we haven't heard anything official about all of those dates. Typically, at this time of year, we're doing final refinements of the budget, but this year we're looking at making some significant adjustments to the budget. And Dr. Rogers, in his presentation, will be updating you on some of the areas that we're looking at for reductions. As you know, we started the budget process in the fall with expectations of continuing our ambitious goals for the district, and some of those goals were incorporated into our budget strategies, which are listed on the left-hand side. Given current circumstances, we need to adjust our goals to ensure that we're in the best position to preserve our programs and services in a time of uncertain revenue. We also need to ensure that the district's financial health stays strong. This will enable us to be able to effectively respond to changes in the economic environment or changes in the learning environment. We're now exploring different strategies for delayed spending or budget sequencing that correspond to notices of potential reductions in revenue, essentially identifying expenses in the budget that will only be made if the revenue stream materializes. We intend to maintain our safe and secure learning environment, and we're going to continue to repair and maintain our facilities and our equipment, but we're going to be focusing only on those related to health and safety. And we're going to continue to see greater efficiencies, which we look for every year. Certainly, there are many concerns in the fiscal environment. Some are more immediate and some are longer term, and we're working on plans to address all of them. The most immediate is the first one, which is the delay in the tax revenue. As part of the one of the executive orders, taxpayers were given until June 1st to pay their taxes, which delays the town's tax payments to the district. So we obviously that impacts our cash flow statement. So on the agenda tonight is a resolution for a TANs should we need to increase our borrowing to make those obligations for June 30th. The next two concerns relate to state aid, which we're going to go through in a little more detail. And certainly a great concern is any mid-year reduction in state aid, which would be very disruptive. As I said, we'll be looking to maintain our financial stability, and reserves are a big piece of that. They enable us to sort of protect the tax levy and minimize impacts of other reductions in reserve on the tax levy. In addition to instability on the revenue side, we also have uncertainty in expenditures on the expenditure side. Things like summer school, additional services for students that we know are going to need. What will social distancing look like in the school setting? And then there are direct hits to expenses, potentially like health insurance. And then finally, we have the delay in the budget vote, and that impacts our operations and our fiscal operations. Typically after the budget vote in May, we're actually starting to award bids now, and then the schools after the budget vote start preparing their purchase orders for the next school year so that we have all of the supplies and materials when the kids come back. So we're looking at how we manage all of these challenges to our fiscal environment. I thought it would be helpful just to provide a reference point for where we were overall from a budget and tax levy standpoint before, I guess, before March 13th, or where we were in early March before the current events. In early March, we had a budget to budget of about 3%. We had certain expectations of state aid based on a January run of state aid. We considered using the same local revenue amounts, or we're anticipating, as we had for this year. We plan to appropriate fund balance and then restricted reserves. And we also had some additional revenue from our debt service fund because we borrowed later than we anticipated. And that left us with a levy somewhere in the range of about 2.8%, which we were, again, still working on bringing our spending plan down, but that left us under the cap at that time, 2.8 versus on the left-hand side, you see the tax cap calculation of about 3.23. So we were a couple of $100,000 at that point under the tax cap. And then if you look to the left, that should be somewhat of a familiar chart. First column being the tax cap calculation each year, and then to the right-hand side, the actual tax levy. And you can see that we've consistently levied under our tax cap calculation. So that's where we sort of were, and we know that that has changed significantly, but I just wanted to give you a reference point really to say how far we still have to go. And this is obviously the tax cap calculation that I've shown you before. It's changed slightly since our presentation back in March. It went up just a couple of tenths of a percentage point as we had made some adjustments. Overall, the fiscal environment, the fiscal crisis doesn't have an immediate effect on the tax cap calculation. We just had to adjust sort of the second or third line down. The coming year exemptions, those are really for capital expenses. We have our capital expenses, which is our debt service, less building aid. And we have to look closely at our building aid, and particularly the potential building aid, because of the delays in some of the projects. That makes that number a little bit tricky to determine. Going forward, the two factors of the tax cap that we'll be watching out for the following year would be the tax-based growth factor, which at the top, again, I've explained that as sort of the brick and mortar development in the community, and determining if the current fiscal environment will ripple into that area. That could impact our tax levy in the following years. And then the CPI in the middle of the page, the allowable levy growth factor is the lesser of CPI, or 2%. This year we're at 1.8. Hard to imagine, something in that range going forward. But those are things that we'll be looking at in the future. But we're at about 3.23 currently. And then this slide just shows is a screenshot from the Office of State Comptroller website. I submitted the tax cap where we were on March 1st. And once the board adopts and we have a final budget, I will update those numbers and resubmit. In trying to understand long-term where the impacts are going to be, certainly benefits is an area that we need to look at, where the economic consequences may ripple in this area. We had at this point, I guess at the March point, we were looking at about a 1.8% increase in our benefits. At about 57 million, benefits represent about 23% of the district's budget. And we saw that most of the increase was in two areas. TRS, which is the second line item from the top, and then health insurance. And in the chart on the bottom, you can see that we had an uptick in the contribution rate for TRS. It was 8.5 this year, and that 1 percentage point increase relates to about an $800,000 increase in our budget. Obviously, the concern there is the longer term, both for TRS and ERS, those first two line items, given that the amount that the district pays is in part related to market performance of the entire state plan. We can anticipate potentially higher amounts in subsequent years as that market performance gets factored into the rolling average that the TRS and ERS use. When we look at health insurance, we see about a $300,000 increase. That is currently factoring in an increase in health insurance estimated at 10% for the 21 school year. So I am talking with other business officials. We're trying to get a sense of if that number needs to be adjusted given all of the events of the day. We also have unemployment insurance is possibly going up if in the event of excessing of positions. So the budget is the expenditure plan. As I said, that's what we've been focusing on. And then the revenue side of the budget, we have state aid, we have local revenue and reserves. And what remains then after you subtract from your spending plan those other sources of revenue is the tax levy. And the tax levy is the amount of money that's raised through property taxes and distributed in the community after all other revenue sources are deducted. And the first revenue source we're going to look at is state aid. So we started in 1920, we had about 17.9 million. The run from the executive budget, which was in January, gave us about 18 million, which is essentially flat. If you look at building aid, which is about the sixth line item down, you can see that we went from about 1 million to 1.3 million. And that's really an expense-based aid. It's the formula works on how much you spend in debt service and other expenditures in your project. So we could say that we were pretty flat at that point. Then there was the legislative run on 3/31, and that gave us a reduction to about 17.8 million, and that is about a $180,000 reduction. What's not what's not apparent here is the reduction that we will take in potential building aid. That's calculated separately. So when you calculate that as well as building aid, we're looking at about a $465,000 deduction. You can also see on the bottom, the last two line items in the legislative budget were the pandemic adjustment for 221 and the I guess offset through the federal CARES restoration. And that's where we were on 3/30/31. Obviously, since that time, we've been hearing quite a bit about additional reductions in state aid from the governor. And state aid equates to approximately 8% of our district revenue, which doesn't seem like it's that material, but the cuts in aid that are being discussed could range anywhere from 2 to 4 million in budget, necessitate budget reductions in 2 to 4 million range, which are material cuts for our district. In addition to those planned cuts, we also have to be prepared for reductions in expense-based aids. I'm just going to go back for a second. In the state aid run, you can see about the 5th item down is transportation aid. So that 2.1 million that's factored into our run is based on an assumed amount of expenditure. Keeping in mind that we've only had about 65% of the expense. If, for example, we were not to have any more transportation expense, that would reduce our aid by about 700,000 for transportation. So in addition to the potential cuts from the governor, there's also hits or reductions we might take in these expense-based aids going forward. For about the past, 7 or 8 years, the district has been using some of its reserves to help support the budget. More recently, we've been funding capital projects and other expenses through the application of reserves. Reserves are money that are set aside for specific purpose. They're a source of revenue that helps stabilize the tax levy. They're an indicator of good fiscal health. They're adequate levels of reserve, give you better credit ratings, which in turn reduce your borrowing costs. Our reserves are reviewed each year by the district's auditors. They're published in the audit report and reported to New York State Education Department. And you can see on the right, that's actually a screenshot from our audit report. And we have a variety of reserves that total about $26.2 million. We had planned to use about 3.8 million to support the 2021 budget, which is the same level that we used in 1920, primarily looking to use the retirement contribution reserve, which is used for supporting the district's expenses related to the retirement contribution. You can see that although we didn't plan to use it this year, the TRS is a new reserve that districts were allowed to fund for the first time last year, and the board approved the establishment of that reserve. So we were able to fund that a little bit. We also have the employer benefit accrued liability, the EBAL, and that reserve is used to pay employees accrued expenses like vacation, sick time when they separate from the district. So those are the restricted reserves that we have, and they're called restricted because they can only be used for those purposes, the purposes for which they were created. There's more flexibility in terms of using your reserves with fund balance. And fund balance is generally, we appropriate a certain amount of fund balance to support the budget each year. This is that part of that 4% that we talk about during the audit. In 2021, we plan to appropriate for capital projects 2.8 million. As we look to reduce some of those capital projects for next year and postpone them for subsequent years, we would also be reducing the amount of reserves that we would use to offset that. We, over the last 2 years, and actually prior to that, we've also appropriated for general purpose some amount of fund balance. And so as over the next several weeks, as we get closer to where closer look at all of the numbers and make our adjustments, we'll have a better sense of the reserves that we will recommend to use to support the budget. So the next time we present, we plan to have more budget detail, and we're continuing to make revisions and reductions in preparation for what we anticipate will be revenue shortfalls. We're waiting for an April 30th update, the first of the quarterly updates that we're anticipating, and as well as an update on the budget vote and related budget deadlines. And that concludes the budget presentation for April.
Thank you, Dr. Rufo. Do any of the board members have any questions for Dr. Rufo based on her presentation?
Yes.
Tracy, I do.
have a question.
Andy?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question about the teacher's retirement. Thanks for the presentation, Dr. Rufo. So that increase was about, was it 8% we're spending? Was that what you said?
800,000, yes.
800,000,
8.3.
okay.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
that's on a rolling rolling results, right? Of a certain.
Yes, 5 years average, yes.
Okay, so the last year for that 2019?
I think it was, I'd have to check, but I think it was 18. No, I think you're right. I think 19, yes.
Okay.
Dr. Rufo,
Yes.
that one, unlike most fiscal plans, they operate on a school year basis. So they do their measurement in June, at the end of June, June 30, as opposed to a December 31st, which is how most funds do it.
Okay, so it's up to June 30 of last year, probably, maybe.
Yeah, it couldn't be June 30 of this year.
Right, so it's had to be of 19, not 18.
Yeah.
19, okay. So, all right, so that number would probably will go up, I imagine, after this year, most likely. Well, assuming if this year is a down year in the financial markets, which so far it is, but we'll see what happens. So that number, that'll be factored into the rolling 5 or whatever, 2020.
That's correct.
So we can anticipate that number increasing, that 800, correct?
Yes, if the market returns do not improve, yes, you would anticipate
Okay.
that number to increase.
All right, thanks. Thank you.
Christy?
Yes, hi. Yes, thanks, Dr. Rufo, for the presentation. I just have a couple of questions. One is, and I'm sure you did your due diligence on this, but I just need to ask anyway. On the TAN, were there any other alternatives to look at? Like, did the government have any things out there as far as for schools, or the New York State governor, has he announced anything? I know he announced pushing out the taxes, but I guess did he offset anything with schools with the financing, or he just figured the schools would figure that out on their own?
I am not aware of any additional resources for school districts for addressing cash flow concerns. We certainly are talking with our organizations, ASBO. We're certainly not the only district in this situation. And we're also in conversations with our fiscal advisor and bond counsel, and we're not aware of any other resources that are available. And again, the TAN resolution is an up to amount, and it is not determined yet that we will need it, but we want to have it in place should we need it.
Okay. And the second question is, for example, and this may apply to other service providers to the district, but I'll pick on insurance. I know it's publicized out there for the consumer because the consumers are using the automobiles less. A lot of automobile companies are giving back a fairly large discount during the the stay at home. Are any of our insurance companies offered, or have we asked them? Because we have less liability with people in the schools, obviously.
I'm not aware of, we're part of NYSER, and NYSER represents most school districts on Long Island and throughout the state. I am not aware of any of discounts that are available. I think that while there may be some, as you said, fewer like cars on the road and things like that, I'm sure there could be other risks that might mitigate savings. But I have not heard of any sort of discounts. But as I said, we're part of this cooperative, so we'll certainly inquire.
Thank you.
Do any other board members have questions for Dr. Rufo?
Yeah, Tris.
Okay,
Hi, yeah, Dr. Rufo, just a quick question. On one of the prior slides, we talked about local revenue of 10.6 million. Is that just pilots, or are there other funding sources in there?
It is predominantly pilots, probably 80% of it is pilots. There's other funding sources like interest income. That's probably one of the next largest one. And then small, I would say immaterial sort of fees and things like that. But yeah.
And then with the pilots, would we consider that to be an item that may be at risk due to the economy, or are those pretty much funded and set in stone? They're less of a concern than other revenue sources.
Those are by their contracts. So if that's helpful at all to know, they're not optional.
Gotcha. So unless somebody becomes insolvent and can't pay their contract, it's not a discretionary budget item that Albany or somebody else can have an impact on.
No, not to my knowledge.
It's an existing contractual.
Yes.
Okay. And then, yeah, Andy asked the other question. Okay, thank you.
anyone else? Okay, thank you. We are going to begin with the approval of minutes of the monthly meeting, March 16th, 2020. May I have a motion, please? Ms. Parker, seconded by Ms. Chang. Are there any questions? All in favor? Opposed?
Aye.
Any abstentions? Approval of minutes of the special meeting dated March 27th, 2020. May I have a motion, please? Mr. DeFilippo, seconded by Mr. Gershon. Are there any questions? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Any abstentions? Approval of minutes for a special meeting dated April 6th, 2020. May I have a motion, please? Mr. Ulrich, seconded by Mr. Feldman. Are there any questions? All in favor? Opposed? Any abstentions? Approval of the minutes of special meeting dated April 21st, 2020. May I have a motion, please? Ms. Parker, seconded by Mr. Gershon. Are there any questions? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Any abstentions? Dr. Rogers, may we have the treasurer's report?
I think that's going to be Dr. Rufo again.
Yep.
I'll take it.
Okay. As indicated in the treasurer's report, cash on hand for the month end February 29th, 2020 was $87,311,748.02. It shows that bank balances for all cash accounts were reconciled to the book balances and were collateralized in accordance with the district's banking agreements and investment policy.
Okay, may I have a motion to accept the treasurer's report? Ms. Parker, seconded by Ms. Chang. Are there any questions? All in favor? Opposed? Any abstentions? Dr. Rogers, the superintendent's report. I know you're going to do this one.
This one I am definitely going to do. First of all, thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. And before I get into the nuts and bolts of the superintendent's report, I just want to say that I hope everyone's families are safe and well. I think we all know that we are living through an unprecedented time in history, something that I hope none of us ever experience again, something I hope our children never experience again. We are obviously doing our best under extraordinary circumstances. And I think one of the things that is happening is that we are seeing some extraordinary people do extraordinary things under these extraordinary circumstances. And I've been incredibly heartened and sometimes almost brought to tears by the stories I'm hearing of people who are raising money for victims, for families, for first responders, kids who are finding ways to innovate and support our healthcare workers and our first responder community. That has been inspiring. We have kids from our robotics team, the teachers that work with them, working on printing protective equipment for healthcare workers and with 3D printers, something would have been inconceivable even 5 years ago. So it is really remarkable to be living through this period in history. We as a school district have been asked, a lot has been asked of us as a public entity to do our part as well. And we are trying to do that as best we can. A couple of nice announcements. First of all, we have the valedictorian and salutatorian, Michelle Lee, Kai Wang. Michelle is our valedictorian. Kai Wang is our salutatorian. We're offering congratulations to them. Our senior, Siyu Yang, is a Newsday Scholar Artist for the month of April. We're very proud of Siyu. Our high school just received a New York State recognition status. The high school has won this the last several years. This is a special category of recognition that the state gives. It's sort of the state's equivalent of Blue Ribbon. And so we're very proud of the high school. We're also very proud of one of the middle school APs at Southwoods Middle School, Ms. Liz Burke, who was named Administrator of the Year by her umbrella union, her statewide umbrella union. Syosset was something we kind of take for granted, but we were once again named one of the best communities for music in the United States by the NAMM Foundation. And that's our 20th year in a row. And while we do take it for granted, we shouldn't, because it's really an extraordinary accomplishment. With that said, I will see if my presentation works as flawlessly as Dr. Rufo's did. She's set the standard for me to try and achieve here. All right, so far this looks encouraging. All right, so just a couple of announcements. April is Census Awareness Month. I did mine. It really was easy. You go to the link. I got something in the mail that had a little number in there that corresponded to me. My household is only 2 people, so it went really fast. But even if it was 3 people, I don't think it would have taken very much longer. So I would encourage you, one of the things that we know is that government funding is going to be tighter than ever in the future. And that's all the more reason why we here in Syosset want to be counted accurately so that we get our fair share of whatever opportunities there are in the future, because we're going to need those to help support us. School construction, there have been some ups and downs with this. The construction was restricted, then it was halted altogether, then it was restarted for certain projects with particular caution in place with crews, and we've been moving along on that. I went to the 2 main construction sites this afternoon and took a look at the progress, and also watched the workers to make sure that they were doing the social distancing and abiding by the rules that we had put in place for them. And the hope is, of course, to move even more quickly. There were a couple aspects of both projects that we were able to start early because the buildings are unoccupied right now. And so instead of having to work around bus schedules and safety of kids, the construction workers really do have their run of the place, and that has allowed some things to move along more quickly. The state has required us to do 3 things as a school district in this period, and this was really imposed not too long after the governor's initial order to close schools. We have been required to develop a continuity of learning plan, and I'll talk a lot more about learning from home in just a minute. But we were also asked to provide childcare for essential workers. So those are first responders, healthcare workers, and others. And the logistical challenges of making that happen were daunting, to say the least. But we have a program that is operating daily at Bayless, and our program has been so successful. We are hosting children of first responders and healthcare workers from a number of neighboring school districts. So Syosset has not just led in this way, but we're really supporting the larger community, not just Syosset. And I'm very proud of that. I'm very proud of the people who are making that happen. And we did not have trouble finding people to staff it, and we did not have trouble finding people to clean it, because I think everyone who's working in that program sees this as the part that they can play in these extraordinary times. Food security, the one thing we know during major crises is that families can sometimes have difficulty. We want to be supportive. There's daily breakfast and lunch service from Aramark, and that's not limited to just people who are having food insecurity issues or would otherwise qualify for some kind of program. That program can be made available to others. And if you need that, just please contact us. The perfect contact person would be Dr. Rufo. But if you can't figure out her email address, you can email me too, and I'll make sure it gets to her as well. So where are we now? This presentation was built for the board meeting a week ago, and I considered taking this slide out. This is a week old now at this point, and every day feels like a week, every week feels like a month. So in some ways, a lot has changed, but the general direction of this slide has not. A week ago, the governor was saying he thought we were over the crest, and he was also complimenting our success in flattening the curve and not having it go as high as and have as many victims as we thought there were going to be. Now the governor is talking about what will happen if this continues, and the data since this slide was created, all is continuing to go in the downward direction, and that's really good news for everyone. The governor said last week that he will make a decision this week about whether and when schools will reopen. So I don't have an answer to the question, will we be open again this year? I don't have an answer to the question, what will summer school look like? I don't have an answer to the question, is this going to go even into the fall? But I'm hoping later this week, we will have a much better sense of what the governor plans for at least the next several weeks, or maybe even next couple of months. And that's going to be a decision, as he said, that he's made based on the data. I just got an email that I believe my reading of the email is that the governor announced that there's going to be a blue ribbon panel or a task force that is going to make some of these decisions about how to reopen. The discouraging news, the second slide from Governor Cuomo's presentations, is that the state has a huge deficit. And this deficit is because the sales tax and income tax revenues that the state counts on are obviously going to be damaged as a result of the economy being shut down and likely sputtering back to life once we reopen. The budget is also balanced on some one-time revenue stimulus money that came out of Washington, and the governor has insisted that it needs more stimulus money in order to be truly balanced. In the absence of that stimulus money, schools could see a cut of as much as 20%. And as Dr. Rufo said, the budget director talked about this again earlier this week, the potential for cuts of up to 20% to schools. For Syosset, that cut would represent about $4 million. And because of the uncertainty in revenues, the governor and the legislature agreed to a very unusual state budget this year. It's a state budget that can change as many as 3 times throughout the course of the year. So the budget was adopted on April 1st, but on April 30th, they are going to look to see if any more stimulus money materializes from Washington. And if not, that whole will be passed along to school districts in the form of cuts. So right now, the state budget is predicated on additional money coming from Washington. If that money doesn't come along, then the impact of that will be felt in schools, and they will announce to us what our potential share of that cut would be. So for that reason, I've cautioned the board that we shouldn't adopt a budget yet. We should wait and see what happens on the 30th, because that could be very impactful to us to know what the magnitude of that cut is as we do our planning. And as Dr. Rufo said, the state budget director said that he does not recommend that school districts adopt a budget prior to May 15th in order to take all of this into account. The other thing that the governor said, and this is the bottom of this slide, is that further cuts may come. So not only will they look at the state budget on April 30th and decide if there's any money that needs to be reduced in the budget, they're going to do that again on June 30th and they're going to do it again on December 31st. So we will at some point have to adopt a budget that goes before the public for a vote. And that will presumably happen prior to July 1, because that's when our fiscal year starts. But it will not be any earlier than June 1, because the governor has said that the typical May budget vote is being postponed until after June 1, but he has not told us exactly when, nor has he told us any of the mechanics of the various filing dates that are required to get to that budget vote. But June 30th at the least would be before school has started. The big challenge is the December 31st number. I started my career working in the legislature the only other year that there was a mid-year cut in school aid, 1990. And I saw how difficult it was for school districts once they had started the school year to accommodate what was that year about a 2% cut in aid mid-year. And it basically meant that programs that were planned for the second semester of the school year were canceled in order to make up the difference. So we're hoping to propose a budget to you that will be durable enough to handle potential mid-year cuts that come down. And what we're trying to do is build a budget that is that makes savings both on the personnel side, but also makes savings on the expenditure side. And even with the expenditures that are in the budget, we're going to delay as many of those expenditures as we can until the second half of the year, so that we don't commit to something and then find out halfway through the year that the state is going to reduce the money that we have. So Dr. Rufo talked about the fact that the original budget that the governor proposed back in January was reduced when the legislature adopted it. And then, as I mentioned, it is balanced, and school aid is balanced with about $1 billion worth of stimulus money. The last time we saw this strategy used was race to the top during the 2008 fiscal crisis, when the federal budget backfilled some lost state revenues. But when that race to the top money evaporated the subsequent year, so for us, that would be the 21-22 school year, that was a second year and a second round of cuts that school districts had to accommodate. So we're attentive to how that played out during race to the top. And we're trying to have a plan that is not just for 1 year, but for the next 2 years, understanding that this could be a difficult year, the subsequent year as well. And again, just having started my career working in government, I know that governments tend to be more generous in election years than they are in non-election years. And this year is a humdinger of an election year. It's a presidential year, congressional year. Both houses of the New York State Legislature are up for re-election. But next year, none of those entities are. And so that generosity may not recur next year. And so the time to do that planning is, of course, now. So very early in this process, before the governor had even started talking about 20% cuts in state aid, we were taught, and there's a mistake in this chart, it should say 10%, 15%, 20% cut in aid. I apologize. I had been asking the staff to do, Dr. Rufo and Ms. Bavard, to put together a staffing and a budget plan. And we were calling these 3 levels deep, deeper, and deepest. And I had asked them to prepare a budget that assumed a 10%, a 15%, a 20% cut in state aid. And so the governor continues to talk about a 20% cut in state aid. That was my deepest number. And obviously we will need to look within that number and see where we can provide a little bit of shock absorber as well. And again, as I said, the mid-year staffing cuts are they're really damaging to program, and they're really unsettling and disruptive to kids' educations, and they're to be avoided at all costs if we possibly can. But that does mean that we have to be more aggressive at the beginning of the year. So what are those actions? We're going to leave a number of teaching positions where there were retirements unfilled. We do have a drop right now. It appears in enrollment at the elementary level. We're seeing some sections that are changing at the secondary level. We have 2 administrative retirements that are going to be left unfilled. There are some other positions that are going to be left unfilled as well. So I'm not calling this a hiring freeze, because there are some other retirements for classroom teachers at elementary that have to be filled. We are shifting not 2 grade levels to co-teaching, but now just 1 grade level to co-teaching, but we still need to hire those co-teachers. And there's no way that you can make these kinds of cuts and not have a programmatic impact. And I'm the last person that would want to see fewer opportunities for kids. And yet what we're trying to do is make sure that we have a supportable budget that preserves as many of the opportunities as we possibly can. So right now we're able to do that, but the big unknown is what the cuts the governor may yet propose in the middle of this year might be. Outside of personnel, as I mentioned, a purchasing freeze, deferring maintenance. I'm a little leery of deferring maintenance because there was so much deferred maintenance at Syosset, and that's why we're in the middle of so many construction projects, some of which to me feel long overdue. And you can't defer the physical plant forever without it also ending up costing you something. But we do believe that there are some maintenance projects that we can responsibly defer, and some construction projects that we're going to improve spaces for kids that are not necessarily in bad shape, and we would defer those as well. And with the deferral of abatements, these are all areas that are safe. So if there is an abatement that needs to be done because the area is not safe, we will of course do it. So again, my job is to look as far into the crystal ball as I can and see what might be out there. And what we don't know is what may happen in the future once we do start to reopen. We don't know if summer school will reopen, what we'll be allowed to do during summer school, what we might be required to do during summer school in the same way that we are doing childcare for first responders right now. I have no idea what we may be asked and required to do. Other governors in other states have talked about starting school years early. Our governor has not said anything of the kind here in New York. So, but we're trying obviously to be attentive to what's going on in other places so that we're thinking about as many of the possibilities that are out there as possible. We have been serving, I think, well, our special education population, but there may be some students who are regressing and might otherwise not be eligible for a year-round program, but in this year might meet the criteria, and so we would have to think about that. And we have already heard, sadly, of members of our community who are impacted by the virus and are dealing with some family situations. And obviously our heart goes out to them. But we also want to be in a position where we can support those families this coming year, and there may be some costs associated with that as well. So Dr. Rufo said that we're using reserves, and what we typically do is we use some reserves and then we replenish those reserves at the end of the year so that the overall balance stays the same from year to year to year. You might ask, maybe this would be a time to draw down on those reserves and try and preserve some of that program. But as I said, my worry is that this might not be a one-year event that we have to live through. This might be a multi-year event that we have to live through. To Mr. Feldman's question, we can anticipate increased pension contributions because of stock market returns not being up to expectations. We're starting to see news articles about the incredible costs that hospitals are undergoing, and that will undoubtedly come out in insurance costs at some point as the hospitals try to recoup those losses. And as I mentioned, that there may be some remedial costs to help catch some kids up. So the what can I do is really closely tied to having a stimulus bill. And this will obviously be online. These links don't do you any good watching them on a screen. But if you feel that you want to see some stimulus money come to New York in order to support the state's budget, leave it at the level it's at right now, that's something that you can do. Online learning and an overview. So before I get into Syosset's plan, I just want to talk a little bit about online learning generally. So we've been doing a lot of research on online learning, of what other states are doing, what other districts are doing, and what the research on online learning shows. So there's a fairly substantial body of research, although it's all very recent, in the college space, because there have been a lot of colleges that have experimented with a number of different models. And I think interestingly, I say experimented because a lot of their first ideas did not turn out to be their best ideas. And so They've been building programs, changing those programs, and consistently refining it. And we've been paying a lot of attention to Harvard and MIT because they jointly created a project called edX. It's edx.org if you're interested. And they are really seen as the pioneers in this. But if I was to kind of summarize a lot of what we're learning, it's that most of the research is around older students, college and high school age students, a lot less around younger students, elementary and middle school. The one thing we know about child development is that children's attention spans and what we call executive function, their ability to self-regulate and stay on task, is very limited, especially for the youngest kids. And it grows as they get older, but it isn't really until high school that you have a lot of executive function and real stamina for learning. So New York has not issued guidance. The BOCES in the capital region, which does work closely with the state ed department, did issue some guidance. Other states have issued guidance around how to build online learning. And so I don't necessarily think that any one of these is the one that we should be following, but I think they are illustrative of the kinds of things that the states are saying to their school districts about how to design online learning. So as I said, we're looking at a lot of the research that came out of the edX project. And the question is, what is the learning that needs to occur at this point in the lesson? And then what is the best delivery model for that particular aspect of the content? And where are the places where the teacher can have the most effect? So lecture, it tends not to be the strongest of instructional tools, but work and practice is. In a classroom, what you would typically see is a teacher doing a lecture at the beginning to introduce the topic, then have students start to work on material and then circulate in small groups and do a lot of small group coaching and feedback with students so that it's possible to see where they're stumbling and then assist them at the point where they're stumbling, rather than doing what we would call teaching to the middle of the class, which would happen when you're doing more whole group instruction. That regrouping is much harder to do in an online setting, obviously, where all of the kids are just little boxes on screen. What we have been seeing is teachers that are innovating, doing things that I've been told they call the pilot co-pilot model, where one teacher is doing a lecture, but the other teacher is approximating that small group by doing live feedback in the chat window. As kids ask questions, they get answers to questions. Kids are turning in work and then getting feedback from teachers through Google Classroom as a way of commenting on the work and trying to strengthen the work. But the one thing that seems clear to me is that we are in our infancy in doing this, and I think we are going to continue to improve and get better at it. But there aren't any really great models out there that we can point to and say, this is what's been so successful elsewhere and what we should adopt here. And what I see our teachers doing is taking advantage of a lot of professional development and consistently making adjustments to how they're approaching this as they see what seems to be working with kids and what also is kind of falling flat. And so I don't anticipate that the way things looked on April 1 is going to be the way they look on May 1. And I don't think that how they look on May 1 is going to be what they look like on June 1. I think this is going to be a place where we continue to pioneer, where we continue to innovate, and where we're probably going to continue to make shifts. As I mentioned, young learners, I think are one of the biggest challenges in this is our young learners. I certainly think that our young learners are appreciating the time that they have in contact with their teachers online. I think that relationship has an enormous value, and we need to preserve that in order to keep our youngest learners feeling connected to their teachers, to their learning communities. And that is a place where, I'm concerned about making sure that when we are re-engaged in live and in person, that we have good plans in place to make sure that we accelerate their learning, we get them caught up. One big challenge in all of this is online security, and a lot of what we've been focused on is thinking about what's on the back end and the infrastructure behind our online learning plan. Obviously, the content's important, the teachers are important, but also having a secure platform is important. We are dealing with student images We are dealing with student images that are in their homes. And we are dealing with students who are not directly under the supervision of an adult, even though they are participating in an online experience with our teacher. It's not the same as being in a room where a teacher is able to use a lot of classroom management tools. And so we've been reinforcing good etiquette. Our kids, for the most part, are just, they're amazing and they're wonderful. They also, I think, even young ones, understand they're going through a very unusual time in history. And for the most part, everyone is bringing their best selves to this: kids, teachers, parents, administrators. But this is new, and it does pose some risks and challenges that we've tried to be attentive to. What are some common questions that are out there? You know, what's going to happen with the graduation, with prom? Dr. Durante, our high school principal, has been in contact with kids, is speaking with them frequently. Obviously, his goal is to stay close to them. They have some strong ideas about what they don't want to see happen. And we're also, you know, listening to what's going on with other school districts and in other states. But for now, the schools are closed until May 15th. And I don't want us to get ahead of ourselves and ahead of the governor. He has an announcement to make this week. We'll wait and see what that announcement is, and then we'll calibrate from there. As I said, I don't know what's going to happen with summer school yet. I don't know if that means we're going to have to enforce social distancing. I don't know if that means we're going to restrict enrollment so that we have fewer kids there yet. We're planning for, in my own mind, 3 different scenarios: an all online scenario, an all in-person scenario, and a hybrid scenario that's sort of halfway in between. And we want to be ready for whatever comes along. And if there's anything that we need to be thinking about now, we don't want to delay. Sports, we just got the announcement last week, obviously, that the spring season is canceled. And, you know, regrettably, this is just one more thing that our seniors are going to miss out on, is the opportunity to have that senior day for spring sports. I've been asked about ending the year early because we canceled, the governor canceled the April break. And as I said, you know, I've been asked questions about starting next year early. Both of those things, I think, would have to come from the governor's office. And we do periodically get on webinars with the governor's office, and they've acknowledged that these are things that they have to think about, but they've also said that they're not close to making a decision on either at this point. So we just have to wait for them. We've been asked some very practical questions. What about my locker, or my gym locker, or my sports equipment, medications that might be on site? If the governor does announce that we're closed for the rest of the year later this week, then we have been building a plan for how to deal with lockers and gym locker possessions, and teachers who are retiring who want to get back and get stuff out of their classrooms. And if once we hear that we are going to be closed, then we'll start executing that plan. I've been asked questions about whether college admissions counselors are going to take the fourth quarter this year into account, and our guidance counselors have talked with college counselors and have indicated that colleges are well aware of what's going on, and they are absolutely taking this into account. And as I said, you know, the most important thing is for our kids to be safe and to be healthy. And we will absolutely do what it takes to get kids caught back up when we are back together again. So what's our plan exactly? The state has required us to file a plan. Our plan is to have kids send us happy pictures from home. That's our plan. Those were collected by our public relations person, Tricia Williams. Thank you for that. When this was prepared for the board last week, I left this slide in, even though it's a week old now, just because I think it's extraordinary. Our first day being closed was March 16, and the Friday before the board meeting was April 17th, so a month and a day. And in that period of time, over 23,000 live meets had been held, and we had 86,000 elementary students participate. So if a student was in 2 live meets in one day, they would count as 2. I just think it is extraordinary how much work we've managed to do with kids, given the size of our district, our scale. It really is, in terms of our back-end platform, kind of extraordinary accomplishment. So at elementary, we want to have one synchronous event per day with the classroom teacher, one synchronous event per day with one of our specials teachers, work on top of that gets rich feedback from teachers, and so that kids are still doing the practice themselves and getting feedback on that practice, holding office hours, responding to parent email and student email. And my understanding is that the volume of both of those has been extraordinary for teachers, and they are trying to manage that volume, which I appreciate. And then we have not forgotten our special education students, and we're providing not only the special education class, but the services and resources for them as well. In the middle school, synchronous events and asynchronous events operating on a class schedule. So one of the things that we discovered was that people were stepping on each other's times, and so we needed a little bit of a traffic cop, and a lot of blended activities. And again, here at the middle school, students are able to work more independently, more easily, and that's been the focus. And then finally at the high school, they are following the bell schedule. Again, trying to select when synchronous and asynchronous is the right instructional tool for the piece of content and the course that students are working in. The one thing I've heard consistently is, particularly with math and math at all three levels, that having a teacher go through the explanation of the math problem, the approach, is one of the most valuable things, one of the hardest things to learn on your own without support. And we're certainly attentive to that. So this is where we are. And again, as I said, this is the data that I use to support my belief that where things are, April 1 is not going to be where they are. May 1 is not going to be where they are June 1. So we've been seeing overall meeting participation by students growing week after week after week. So there's obviously a shortened week in there for the April 9th and 10th, but overall, the participation continues to be more robust. And I do attribute this to teachers getting more comfortable with the tools, more familiar with the tools, finding ways to use it. And even though this is live meet data, this is the data I use because it's easy to measure. Einstein said not everything that can be measured matters, not everything that matters can be measured. There's a lot of other things that are going on that we don't have tools to measure right now, and we're working on trying to figure out how to measure that. Because there's a lot more opportunities than just these particular ones. Special education, the state adjusted and the feds adjusted the rules so that we could do this in the online environment. It's not perfect. It's not the same as the classroom. None of this is the same as the classroom. But we've been given the support and the recognition by both the state and the feds that we can and we should be doing this the way that we are. We've heard from a lot of parents that it is challenging providing support for kids all day, every day. And it is challenging for kids who are going through their own versions of cabin fever as we are dealing with all of these challenges. So our behavioral support team have put together a whole website of parent support tools and strategies. And I'd encourage you to take advantage of those. And there's just helpful tips. As I said, we have a number of synchronous and asynchronous tools. We've built a support site. This is one of the pages from the support site for our own teachers to help them think through the selections that they make for which tools to use in what situations. We have announced now at secondary how we're going to be doing the grading. And the idea behind the grading here is to recognize that there are a lot of students that are going through extraordinary circumstances right now. And the last thing we want to do is add an additional burden. So if a student has a good grade going into the fourth quarter, having a bad quarter is not going to do any harm to them. But we also recognize that there are students who want to finish strong, or they were hoping for the fourth quarter as an opportunity to raise their grade. And this will provide them with that. Their classroom work will be graded. It will show in the Infinite Campus portal. You'll see a grade in progress. And if you keep up with that work, it's possible even to raise a grade going into this last quarter, despite what's going on around us. In the middle school, it's a little less complicated because there are fewer transcript implications. And at all levels, we've been looking at the curriculum, and we're calling it compacting, but it's really identifying what are the highest priorities to be ready for the next year. what do you need to make sure are the foundational skills that are in place? And there are other things that we can circle back and catch up on, but we want those foundation skills to be okay. The state's made some changes. Obviously, the 3 through 8 testing was canceled. The Regents exams have been canceled. The accountability determinations, which is the state taking all of that data and grinding it into some sort of an evaluation of us as a school system, has also been suspended for a year. We always do well on those determinations. That was why the high school got the reward school designation, but important to note that that's been delayed. I just want to thank Joanne Mannion, Christine Payne, Laura Maria, everybody who works on that team. What you don't see is all of the tools that are behind the screen that the teachers are using. And we have built just an extraordinary back-end infrastructure in an incredibly small amount of time. These are all tools, and this is just the first page. These are all tools that are available to teachers, resources that we put in place. And to put a resource up here, it's not as simple as just getting something from a company. They have to certify to us that they are compliant with all federal and state privacy laws. That involves our attorneys. It's a very complicated process, and this is being built out. We've also built out an online professional development academy for our teachers, and every day there are opportunities for our teachers to take advantage of professional development so that they become more fluent with these tools. The better they are at this, the more confident they're going to be using these tools, and it just means a richer experience for kids. And these have been heavily subscribed, which I'm very proud of. As I mentioned, this is an example of what we call the YAG, a year at a glance. This is a curriculum pacing guide at the elementary level. And for the third marking period, we've identified priorities and resources. So within the topics that are already there, what are the most important subtopics that we need to focus on? We're working on trying to measure student engagement. We are seeing that in the home environment, different students are engaging differently. You would think that everyone would attend the live meet in the same way, but some attend, some engage in that live meet, some engage in the chat. Some don't do the live meet, but they do the work. Others do the live meet and they don't do the work. And so we're seeing a continuum of engagement, and we're trying to measure where students fall along that engagement. Our first priority immediately after closing was to make sure that we didn't have students that fell through the cracks. And we have identified some students that are disengaged entirely. And every student who is disengaged entirely, we have reached out to the families, and they are in the caseload of a social worker in the school district. Then we've identified students that have been low engagement, and those are all being addressed by the building level leadership at every level. And we're also noticing some differences, kids voting with their feet a little bit between core academic classes and some other kinds of classes. And we want to support all of our teachers, and we want to support engagement in our platform and understand better what kids are doing. So that work is ongoing, but we are recording attendance in Infinite Campus now. And we are using that both so that we know what's going on with kids more granularly, so that it attaches to our Infinite Campus system, but also so that we can identify places where we want to continue to reach out to parents. We've been making lots and lots and lots of phone calls and have been since the beginning, but we want to move into more of an automated system, which is how it was when we were in real life together. We've gotten, I'll put these all up. This will be posted online, and these are really more for the online version, but I have gotten a number of messages of support and appreciation, which I've been so pleased to receive. And then just like to, as I have been doing, end on some bright spots. We have, as I mentioned, kids who are doing incredible work with 3D printing to protect first responders and healthcare workers. We had a 7th grader invent a social distancing app that, if installed on your phone, will tell you when you're getting too close to someone else, which I think is really clever. He got interviewed on a national podcast, and we had a number of students send inspirational messages to first responders and nursing home residents. And I'm just always amazed by how this community pulls together. I heard of parents that had pulled together bingo games, and we're using the bingo games as a fundraiser to support people in the community. And then I'm I'm always so proud to be associated with a community that has just such an incredibly big and giving heart. And so even in the midst of these extraordinary circumstances, people are doing extraordinary things. And that's why, for me, whenever I say, we will get through this together, it's not an aphorism. It's not just a slogan. I see it. I see people pulling together and supporting one another. And that's why I believe that we will get through this stronger together. So that concludes my report. And I realize it was incredibly lengthy. Hardly feels like a month has passed, but obviously a lot has gone on since, and there was a lot to catch up on. So thank you for that.
Dr. Rogers, thank you. Thank you for the length. I'll say it's thorough and necessary because we have a lot of community questions about the budget, about what's going to happen in the future, about what we're doing with online learning, about the grading, and you've covered a lot of it. With that, are there any board members that have questions for Dr. Rogers about his presentation? Carol?
Yes, Dr. Rogers, thank you so much for your presentation. I have two questions. The first one was which library which school library will not be getting the reconstruction this summer or going forward? And then the second question is, we've been, for the first year, I think it was the first time last year that we used the Regents grade to determine part of the reason whether the student 8th grader transition into 9th grade could go to the geometry honors or not. If the Regents is canceled this year, how are we going to do that? Or we're just going to look at the math grade in 8th grade? Thank you.
Sure. So I'll answer those in reverse order, since the second one is the easier of the two. So obviously there isn't going to be a Regents exam. I haven't talked with Dr. Genova, who's our math supervisor, about what he has planned as a plan B, but I'll follow up with him and I will send something around to the board to let you know what he has in mind. But I'm sure he's attentive to it. It's just not something that I've focused on yet at this point. On the first one, we had been talking about doing some renovations to the middle school libraries. They were actually the first to get some changes. We've gone through this sequence of doing libraries, and they got some light changes early on, and then we went through the elementary libraries, and certainly the high school library had a major change, and we were going to circle back around to those. And then the Willits Library is also, it had gotten some cosmetic changes early on in the process, but hadn't gone through the same full makeover. But Willits has also been doing a lot of the pilot furniture projects, the flexible furniture projects. So there have been some resources that have been put into the library, and the library is in good shape. So the hope would be to leave a placeholder for those in the budget, and then make a decision sometime through the year. If the money from the state does materialize, it might be possible for us to do those projects. If the money from the state doesn't materialize, then we would push them forward a year and reevaluate where we are.
Thank you.
Trey, I have a question.
Go ahead, Sue.
Dr. Rogers, when you were talking about towards the beginning, personnel reductions, and you had said that, we're just not planning on refilling. I don't remember was how many retiring to 12 maybe. What if it's some, for a course that is in need of a replacement teacher, like a science class at the high school or something that class is a necessary class? Won't a teacher you can't necessarily just move another teacher in there. It has to be somebody qualified for that spot. And secondly, have we been considering any type of personnel reductions aside from retiring teachers, maybe non-teaching staff?
So, okay, there's a lot in that. First of all, I just want to compliment the work that Ms. Bavard has done this year. This has been an extraordinary year to lead the staffing discussions in the district. It's been hard conversations with people about transfers that might not have been their first choice to rebalance where people are. It has been conversations about how to restructure programs. We recognize that there are often some classes at the high school where if we have more interest, we'll open another section even if that section is not well subscribed because it's the last section to open. And it's not going to be possible to do a lot of those things this coming year. But are we staffed for the core academic classes that we have always had with people who have the right, not just the right certifications, but the right background knowledge to do that? Yes, we are. And I actually think it's extraordinary that didn't encounter more difficulties making sure that we had the right people doing the right work in all of the right places. And that is because of just really remarkable work that Ms. Bavard and Dr. Curry and Dr. Durante in particular have been doing to try and accommodate these changes. But to the second part of your question, we've gone about as far as we can go in terms of the target that I gave them to meet with just using, trying not to fill as many vacancies as possible. If a number comes out of the governor on April 30th that is a dramatic reduction beyond what I've told them to try to plan for, there's no question in my mind that we're going to have to do more muscular things. And it's obviously the last thing I want to do. It's the last thing anyone wants to do. So my hope is that it doesn't become necessary to do something more muscular, but that is where we would have to go next.
Does anyone else have any questions for Dr. Rogers? Chris Ulrich?
Tom, you go ahead. I know you don't have video.
No, go ahead, Chris. Go ahead, Chris.
Okay. So Dr. Rogers, thank you. I have two questions. The first one is around attendance, and I know you were touching on that. Are we taking attendance and are teachers or the schools calling on families where the kids aren't present? Because, and especially early on, I'm sure there may have been some kids who were choosing not to show, some who didn't know that a class was being held, or some who maybe weren't able to connect. So do we have a defined policy through the district that either a teacher or the school itself is going to call on a family if the kid has been absent from so many classes or so many days, so a kid doesn't end up missing a week of math, not realizing that it was being held and they didn't know how to connect?
You said you had two questions. You want to ask them both and then I'll answer both, or?
Sure. So the second one, looking forward through the rest of this year and God forbid, next fall and winter, if we have some sort of a repetition of this, all the teachers have been doing great. They've been contributing. They've been trying hard. This is a bizarre environment, and I am completely appreciative of the work the administration and the teachers are doing. But how do we keep pushing forward to more consistency and more of a normal environment? Because I know we've given the teachers a lot of latitude to try to figure this out. Some are teaching every day, some a couple times a week with self-study, some maybe once a week or every other week with a lot of self-study. How do we get to a place where, okay, we say, just like in the school, there's a certain amount of instruction and group project and with our everyday teaching, how do we, work our way towards that? Because, we started with sort of the 2-week experiment and then the governor extended again. We don't know if the governor is going to extend for another 4, 5, 6 weeks. It happens again in the fall. I think a lot of parents' concerns are everybody's doing the best we can, but at some point, are we missing out and kids aren't getting what they need, that by the time things get back to normal, we're too far behind to catch up?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm writing down to make sure I get everything.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll take them in the order you asked them. So attendance taking, we have been attentive to attendance right from the start. The nuance is how we recorded in Infinite Campus. And so recognizing that the environment is different, it sort of raised questions about, like, this doesn't analogize to what we were doing in the real world anymore, because we have elementary students that are participating daily, but not in everything that's available to them daily. And so, but you think about an elementary school, a kid is present and they're present for the day, or they're not present for the day. So we've been trying to, most important thing, where are these kids? Are they engaged in instruction at all? We don't want them to fall through the cracks, as you suggested, and
Right.
that is the most important thing. And we want to make sure that we know that you know, if they're not participating, what's the reason why they're not participating? Are they overwhelmed? Do they have a family situation we need to know about? We have to worry about, you know, and I would hope that this doesn't happen to anyone in Syosset, but we do have to worry about kids in homes that may not be safe. And we want to connect with those kids to make sure that if something is going on, that we're attentive to it. So all of those things are very much in our lens. The evolution to getting this into Infinite Campus is once we start putting data into Infinite Campus expects for attendance to be reconciled. What does reconciled mean? Excused absence, unexcused absence, excused for what reason? Sick or religious observance, or we have all these different categories. So we have to get to a place where we have a regular system for how we record all of this. But that doesn't mean that we haven't been attentive to attendance. And for kids that are not participating, every building has, it's called a multidisciplinary team. And that will be psychologists, building principal, in some places social worker, guidance counselor at the secondary. And those multidisciplinary teams are all focused on these kids that make it onto a hot list. And then somebody's got to call these families. At the high school, there's a robocalling system if kids skip a class. And so there was some robocalling going on. One of the technical challenges that we have to solve is that right now what's happening is people are not answering the phone calls that are coming because our staff are working from home. Understandably, they're blocking their own personal phone numbers. And so parents are not picking up a blocked phone number because they don't want to be robocalled by a vendor or something. And so they're leaving a message, but people don't call back. When you get that number from the 5600 extension, parents pick that up because that's school and there's something going on. So we'd like to see if there's a way that we can somehow route it through the school or make it look like an official phone call that's coming in so that we get a little bit better contact with parents. Now, a lot of the building principals have parents' personal contact information and they just call directly. But what we're trying to do is leverage our attendance clericals to get them to do this work as well. And they're happy to do the work and they're willing to do it from home, but it's just been much harder for them to connect because of that. On the second,
I'm sorry, just on that first point.
Yep.
Do we have any policies, criteria in place where the student has been unaccounted for a certain amount of time and now it's time to call? Not the mechanism of how we call, but is it the first day we're not seeing them? Is it the third day? Is it a week? Do we have that in place?
Yeah, so at the high school, as I said, they already had this, the robocall if you skip a class system in place, but it's automated. Okay. I would want to talk with a little more specificity with each of the building principals to know how they're doing it. But we have been talking about this daily and they feel like they're on top of this. I haven't asked the question like, what's your number? Because they feel so strongly that they are all over the families that are having kids that are somewhat disconnected from the learning community. But we can certainly, I can ask each building if they have a criteria that they use or, how many kids are on that MDT list, the multidisciplinary team list every week that they're going through, and how does a kid earn a spot on that list in your building? And, what do you do if the follow-up doesn't work through? But typically, they're referred to our social workers. And, we're staffed with social work for a very different kind of climate right now. And so I am a little worried about overwhelming them. And they're being supported by guidance counselors, the psychologists, the building principals, but the psychologists are also trying to provide services to kids that are on the kids' IEPs as well. And so there are some scale limitations to this, but we have to figure it out for all the reasons that you state. What about next fall and next winter and about consistency? And will we, be your last comment, too far to catch up? So the one thing I'm becoming more and more convinced of is that where we are with our online learning plan, Syosset is in a leadership position. I speak with my colleagues frequently. I read papers and see things that are online. And I think we have a very robust plan. And a number of my colleagues have asked me for for me to share with them what it is that we're doing here. And I think that's because they're hearing good things. And this isn't about a race, and it isn't about being better than others. This is all of us trying to figure it out together and trying to support one another. And I have certainly called a lot of colleagues for ideas and advice as we've been going through this process. So I don't want to suggest otherwise, but I do think that we're in a very good position. And so there's no question in my mind that, not yet at least, online learning is not as good as in-person learning. And it may be, after we have more than 6 weeks of experience with it, it could improve to the point where it might rival the classroom, but we're certainly not there yet. But I do think that we're not at a place where you'll say Syosset's kids have been disadvantaged against the rest of kids in New York State, or the rest of kids on Long Island, or the rest of kids in Nassau County. We're all going to have the same challenge of trying to accelerate learning in the fall and catch kids up. Every district is going to have that challenge because, again, the online classroom is not as good as the in-person classroom, not yet. But if this does persist into the fall, or if the strategy is reopening followed by closing, reopening followed by closing, as some people are suggesting, then we're going to have a system that is not the one that we invented literally on the fly. We're going to have a system that is the Syosset system. And the one thing I know about this board, and you've said this to me over and over again, even as the board members have changed, this theme has been the same. You want every kid in Syosset to have a consistent experience, no matter what elementary school they go to, no matter what middle school they go to. And you know, we frame that internally as the light, oh boy, the tight and the loose. That was going to come out all wrong, but I caught myself. The tight and the loose. So, you know, the buildings get to have their own personalities. The teachers get to use professional judgment, but those two things can't stray so far that in the end you conclude that two kids are having a different experience in the same school district. And so undoubtedly, you know, the staff is all familiar with the metaphor of the tight and the loose. We talk about that a lot relative to things. And I don't think anyone would be surprised when we start saying, if this is going to be something that we're doing for the duration, not just the duration of the remainder of this spring, but that this is going to be something that we're going to anticipate is going to be an entire fall semester, or a vaccine is a year away. And so we're going to have to think about doing this for a year until the vaccine is available. Then it won't look the same as it does right now. It's going to have to look different. And I don't think that there's resistance to that. I think the issue is that this is an iterative process, and it's progressing over time. That's why I'm proud of the graph. The graph shows that things are going in the right direction. Are we there yet? Do we feel like we've got it all figured out? No. Do I feel like it's better this week than it was 3 weeks ago? Yeah, I do feel strongly about.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Any other board members with questions?
Yes, Tracy. It's Tom.
Martola.
Yes. Dr. Rogers. Thank
hi,
you for
Tom.
thank you for that in-depth presentation. As a father of a second-year-old, I have really now learned second grade again, and I see how we're really all in it together. And I see how difficult it is for the teachers, obviously, not to be able to see all the students and how hard it is. So from a parent's point of view, is there a way, like we had done, for instance, if we were going to change the busing time, is there a mechanism that we can put in place, even the survey, where parents can give feedback, teachers can give feedback, students can give feedback to what's going on, and how that can kind of help, you know, move the process along? And then my other question is, obviously, I'm trying to learn all of the new platforms that we use. I'm familiar with second grade. Is there also a place where there's resources for the parents to kind of learn those and utilize some of those tools? Because obviously we're doing like co-teaching, and how can we help to kind of improve the overall experience? Because we're here, obviously I'm sitting right next to my daughter the whole time, so.
Yeah, both great questions. I know all the building principals have been getting a lot of feedback from parents, and they're welcoming it. And you know, what they have said to me is that, same as in real life, The places where there needs to be adjustment often starts with a conversation between a parent and a teacher, then a parent and a building principal. And what I've seen is that, and it's not just problems that can be solved at that level, but suggestions can be incorporated at that level. And I haven't run into people that said, gee, I don't want to make this better. What I want to do is, somebody has a better idea and I just want to reject it. I think if anything, if you see a little bit of hesitancy, it's mostly just a bandwidth concern, because people kind of feel like they're flat out at this point and trying to do as much as they possibly can. But that process of iterating and becoming better has to continue. And the best place to do that is to have a conversation with the classroom teacher, have a conversation with the building principal, because those end up being a lot more nuanced. And then there's the opportunity for follow-up dialogue as well. On the second question about parent resources, I think it's a point well taken, and I want to go back and talk to the team about what is available out there. I'm not as familiar. I know that Go Math, which is one of our math platforms, has a lot of online resources that are associated with it as well. There's things that students can be doing, but there's also explanatory content that's on there. I'm not sure if that's made available to parents. So I know that the administrators are watching this board meeting as well. So you all better be taking notes, because I'm going to want stuff on my desk tomorrow. And I'll get that back to you. But just hearing you say that, I'm thinking about the back-end resource that we built for teachers, and then the front-facing resource that we have for parents on behavioral kinds of challenges. I think a new frontier for us could be starting to build some parent-facing resources around curriculum, and I think that's a really great idea. And I hate to add it to Joanne Mannion's plate, because she's been doing so much work with the online platform, but we'll work on that, because I think it's a great idea. Thank you.
Rob, did you have a question?
Yes. I have two questions for you, Dr. Rogers, as I know you like to receive them in pairs. Question one, and they're sort of related, is the temporary cuts that you mentioned in terms of not hiring new personnel and other cost-cutting measures. Do you have a sense of approximately how much we would save if we made those cutbacks? And then my second question is, have we considered what additional costs the school district may incur as a result of new social distancing measures that may be, imposed by the state? Obviously, these are going to be what we like to, unfortunately, know as unfunded mandates. For example, I've read a possibility of districts having to, supply face masks and maybe more than one per person, per student per day, gloves, taking students' temperatures before even entering the school and the personnel associated with that. Do we need to take these into consideration when forming our budget?
So we do have, so I'll answer the questions in order. When I asked Dr. Rufo and Ms. Bavard to put together the budget, I said we had this deepest plan. The deepest plan was assuming a 20% cut in state aid. That would be about roughly a $4 million cut in the budget. And I asked them if they could do that in a combination about 50-50 of personnel savings and non-personnel savings. So it would be about $2 million worth of personnel savings, $2 million worth of NPS. And that is accomplished with the without having to do any layoffs of active teachers. That would be accomplished entirely through attrition. So if we have to go deeper than what I called deepest, the $4 million cut, then we would have to start looking at accessing positions. So at this point, that hasn't been possible. We haven't gone through all of the positions in the organization yet, so we're still working our way through the staffing, but the first cut through of staffing and where we are right now in that staffing doc is teachers, administrators. And then the next, we'll start going through other positions in the district next after that. So we have to staff the program first, and then we have to support the program second. So now we're going to go through the program support. The additional costs for social distancing. So my colleagues and I are speculating about what it might look like if we were to come back, partially. How would you reduce the number and headcount of people in the same place? And I've come up with 4 or 5 ideas of my own. I'm reluctant to even say them out loud for fear that someone will say, oh, this is what Syosset's doing, because that happens. But anything that has fewer kids in school means you're going to have more kids at home. So they're either some are at home for part of the day and others are at school, or it's some are at home for part of the year while others are at school, and they flip-flop. You could, longer days to stretch out the number of hours that kids are in school, so there are fewer kids during the hours. All these ideas are out there. All of these are kinds of, it's me borrowing from the library of overcrowding strategies. Right now, you say to me, 30 kids fit in a classroom, and I say, I agree. If you say to me 15 kids fit in a classroom, even though it's the same size, then I say, oh, my school's overcrowded. And I go to the overcrowding playbook, and things like split sessions, 5 semester years, 5 quarter years. You have 1 quarter empty all the time. So you just rotate through the year where that quarter belongs. These are not my inventions. These are standard things that school districts do to deal with overcrowding. So, but I can't answer any of those questions in terms of staffing costs until somebody tells me what the number is at which a classroom is overcrowded. So if we're overcrowded at 10 kids in a space, then that's one strategy. If we're overcrowded at 20 kids in a space, that's a different strategy. But I don't, so those will be the big costs. The cost of masks or gloves or buying infrared thermometers, those are going to pale in comparison to staffing costs. And right now we're going in the direction of less staffing costs, not more. And I hope that in the governor's calculus, he has to weigh the staffing costs of social distancing conditions that he may impose against the cuts that he is, and not, I'm sure he doesn't desire to send cuts to anybody. He's doing what needs to be done to balance his budget, but those two things will certainly run into conflict with one another if we're required to do them. And again, I think same with face masks, gloves. Face masks are only as good as the way they're used. Gloves, if you touch something dirty with the glove, now you're just using a dirty glove. So they don't necessarily make us safer. Temperature, I do see some value in having the ability to take some temperatures, but I'm not sure about the civil rights implication of taking temperatures without any evidence of sickness in some sort of a large scale way. So I think we would have to get some guidance from Albany on all of those things before we would really be able to execute it. But the one thing we know is we have to reduce the budget. And so on the one hand, I would want to say to you, yes, I've left money aside for these additional new costs, but in a reduced budget, it just means that we'll end up reducing somewhere else to pay for these additional costs if they become mandated.
Dr. Rogers?
Hey, Chris.
Question. A little bit to add along with the social distancing, but everything I'm hearing is that unfortunately what we are currently experiencing will probably take us a while. There's consensus with people who agree with some distancing and more sanitary conditions and wearing masks and things like that for personal safety. The other thing is that this obviously will impact not only the size of the classroom, but the sports these students play, the cafeterias they're in. everywhere they go. Do you think we should, I think we should be looking at some component of ongoing online learning and bring it up to the level that most of the colleges use for online learning. I'm not talking about the same instructional, I'm talking about the accountability on both the student and the teacher side. Because a lot of the students who have to do online learning right now, because they're not allowed to go back to, for example, state colleges, are held accountable, for the learning, for the homework, and the tests. And by doing a component of that, maybe part of the day, I don't know what it would look like, but it would certainly space out all the schools.
Yeah, and that's what I was alluding to when I said that you might have some kids getting instruction from home while other kids are getting instruction in the school environment. That instruction from home would obviously be online. And then how you would structure that might look different. Elementary and certainly secondary, where you have period by period kinds of attendance. And how you would make it fair so that some kids weren't getting the more optimal in-school environment and other kids were getting the less optimal home online learning environment. And also looking at just ages of kids and recognizing that the online environment is probably least effective for our youngest learners because it's not how they learn. It's not how their brains are wired yet. And I would put a large priority on trying to see if there was a way that we couldn't have more in-person contact with our youngest learners, and thinking K-1-2 in particular. And that's not to say that good things aren't happening. Good things are happening, but you go into a kindergarten classroom and you watch how the teacher works with them all day long and sets up routines and norms things with them. And that kind of work has to happen in person. It's hard to imagine it happening any other way. But I agree that, and kind of goes back to what I said earlier, if this becomes our de facto strategy, not for this period of emergency education, but as an ongoing strategy as a district, it's not going to look the same on September 1 as it does even on June 1. And I think on June 1, we're going to have evolved the platform significantly yet. And we'll have had, summer to debrief with others. I think there will be some research that comes out of this giant nationwide experiment on online learning. And I hope that we stand up well when that research comes out, but I'm sure we're going to learn some things from others.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions for Dr. Rogers before we continue? Okay, there's no correspondence or legislative items. We had 2 discussion items that were begun in February, and before that, with respect to HPV vaccination, several board members had requested that a letter be sent to legislators in connection with proposed HPV legislation. And at the time, we had heard from several of the board members, but not enough board members to warrant a directive to Dr. Rogers to put together a letter on our behalf. So at this time, are there any other board members that we haven't yet heard from that have an opinion on this issue?
Tracy? Hello? Yeah, I don't think that we should be sending in a letter on behalf of the board with this HPV issue. I think that there are differing opinions in the community. We have heard from some people about that. And so I think writing a letter is taking a stance, and we're not being representative of all the different opinions in the community. So I don't believe we should be doing that.
All right, thanks. Is there any other board member who hadn't given an opinion the last time that has one now? Carol?
Hi, yes. Yes, we had a long discussion about this at the previous board meeting, and then we have very different opinions in the community as well. I do not believe that we should be taking a stance on this to send a letter to the state. Thank you.
Sorry, I was on mute before. Okay, so we had 4 board members in February that were in favor of the letter, and there are 5 board members who would not like to write a letter. And with that, there aren't enough board members to have a directive to Dr. Rogers to write a letter in connection with the proposed legislation.
Tracy, can we just
Yes.
get a vote on that to make sure that we're 4-5? I'm not sure where everybody lies on that.
Well, it's not a vote, but I could tell
Or a
you that
nod.
it was not a vote, but I could tell you that there were 4 the last time, and there are 5 this time. And for anyone who thinks that they were miscounted, they can certainly speak up. But
Yeah, I don't know what the count is because we heard from 3 people.
we have well, I can remember who spoke last time, and Tom
I spoke
Rotolo,
last time, yeah.
Tom Rotolo, and Anna, and Chris Ulrich, and Chris DiFilippo were in favor of the letter. So there are no other board members that I have heard from that are interested in the letter. And so with that, we don't have enough for a directive to issue a letter on behalf of the board. So that concludes the discussion for today. And the next item on discussion items is the lighted road sign. And where we last let off, we had asked Dr. Rogers to, I believe, just get a final pricing on what it would cost. And there was a discussion with the board that when we got that information, we would then decide where we wanted to place at least one board sign. So since that time, I know Dr. Rogers had given us a price. Dr. Rogers, if you could just remind us, please, what the price of that roadside was, and then the discussion could continue.
Sure. With the cost of the signage, then the installation of the signage, obviously you have to run electrical to it. We were looking at something that was going to be in the neighborhood of between $60,000 and $70,000 all in.
Does anyone have any? Rob?
Yes, so I had previously expressed support for the sign. I still think it's something that I would really like to certainly have in the future. However, I think things have obviously changed significantly since our last discussion about this. I think at this point in time that it's fiscally irresponsible of us to be spending money like that on something like this, especially in light of the fact that we're not hiring teachers to fill staff who have retired. I think it's something that we should certainly revisit at a later date when things, are different, maybe a year from now. But I can't support that at this point any longer.
Andy?
Yeah, I agree with Rob. We talked about this a while ago, and obviously things are different now. And with possible 20% or more budget cut down the road, I don't think it's the right time to be spending this money on the signs. Although, I know we decided to do it at one point, but perhaps we could push it off somewhat.
Do any other board members have an opinion on whether this is something that they'd like to continue on after this year?
Tracy, I like the tour.
Yes, Chris, go ahead.
Oh, okay, thank you. Well, one is I don't know if that's one-sided sign or two-sided signs. I supported it before. I still support it. I think there's value in it. It's not a significant amount of money, which you'll find of all the project changes being proposed later for approval. It's almost like a drop in the bucket. It's a way of communicating out to the community, okay, especially in these times, very quickly, rather than, just through the social media. It's another way of communicating wherever that sign or signs are. I think picking a lower cost location, but yet highly visible, and we discussed the significance of how that would communicate and be effective with the overall community, should still be considered and supported.
Andy?
Sorry.
Andy,
Andy,
you're
you're-
I was
muted.
muted. I know, sorry. I think it's a good idea to have the sign. I just think that right now is not a great time for it, and maybe we could just, address it at a later date. Especially since, no one's supposed to be out right now. Anyway, so that's just my point. I still support it, just not right now.
Yeah, I know you said that, but the people will be going out there, and we hope and we need to have the schools open because the governor clearly indicated that is what's going to help trigger the economic recovery for the state as well as the other states. But, everybody's entitled to their own opinion.
Carol?
As Dr. Rogers stated earlier, that we're getting a 450,000 cut from the state, and that's just the 20%. And in my opinion, $60,000 to $67,000 is it's a lot of money, and that money we can use that to help us with the online learning, or to there's so much we can do with that money. So I would like to visit this topic later on. Just not now. At least let us get through this time, especially now we're doing the budget time. Let us get through the budget time for next year, and then we can definitely come back and visit it. I mean, it's a great idea to have signs. I've passed by a lot of schools, and then they all have visible signs, but it's just not the right thing to do at this time, in my opinion. Thank you.
Sue Parker?
Yeah, I agree with what Rob and Andy and Carol have said as far as, it's not that it's a bad idea, although honestly, for that cost, I would rather see a teacher get rehired at this point in time and then see what happens in the future. But just to have one sign that's one-sided in a remote section of the town, honestly, only people with kids in the high school would see that sign anyway, because it's not, the high school is not in a place that people drive by on a regular basis unless they have a child in the high school. So it would be a sign really for high school parents, which still has value and use. But I think that at this point in time, we should hold off until, resources are, not as tight.
Chris, you?
Yeah. So, I agree. I love the idea of the signs. I'm very concerned about anything budget related right now. But Dr. Rogers, and this is probably a separate discussion, but what other communications methods do we have with the community? Not just the families who are currently enrolled, but the families who live in the district and should know what's going on, but they're not currently enrolled. And can we expand those programs? So for example, we have a robust email platform, but I believe it only goes to families currently enrolled. Can we expand that data to get information to the rest of the community, and accomplish the goals without spending, $60,000, $70,000 that we may not have right now?
Sure, I'm happy to answer that. So the platform that we've typically used, and you've all received these in your mailbox, is the Syosset Pride newsletter. So it's a printed newsletter. We had just moved to 4-color, and that goes to every residence in Syosset, not just the people who are connected with the school. Obviously, you know, especially through the first couple of weeks of the pandemic, I put myself on a 2 to 3 day cadence to try and communicate with the learning community about what was happening, and clearly email was the best venue for doing that. One of the things that we've tried to do is expand some of our social media platforms. We were heavy users of Facebook. Now we're also on Instagram and tweet and on Twitter. Everybody except, of course, me, but it's just not something that I've been native with. We have started a YouTube channel as well. And I do know that there are ways of purchasing email addresses for people. We do have more than just the learning community in that email group. There are people who have chosen, their kids have left school, but they've chosen to stay connected. We have also made connections. There are 3 senior communities in our area, and we've made some connections in each of those senior communities. And so we've tried to take special care to keep them involved in what's going on. So we have some email addresses for them as well. People have indicated that they want to stay abreast of what the school is up to. So it's not, it's certainly not universal, but it's not strictly limited to the school either. It's a little bit of a hybrid. But it is more of an opt-in rather than a, here we are. If you don't want to hear from us, you know, mark us as junk.
Just my point of view on the signs is that we should be waiting. That's an idea that the board has supported already. So that's not an issue. It's just a matter of when. And when we're talking about cuts and changes to, you know, to staffing or programming, it just wouldn't feel right to me to spend that money on a sign, which is certainly an enhancement, but wouldn't be considered necessary. Are there any other opinions with respect to this issue before we move on to the the business of the day? Okay, thank you all very much. Okay, the following is new business. A1 is the approval of staff changes for certified and civil service staff. May I have a motion, please? Sue Parker, seconded by Carol Chang. Are there any questions? All in favor? Opposed? Any abstentions? A2 is the appointment of Christian Harrigan to the position of assistant principal for middle schools. That's both middle schools on a probationary basis. May I have a motion, please? Rob Gershon, seconded by Andy Feldman. Are there any questions? All in favor? Oh, Chris?
Is that a
do you
quick
have
question?
Yes.
Just to confirm, this isn't so much the creation of a position as much as a responsibility change.
That's
along
correct.
those lines.
So we had 2 retirements in what are called administrative assistants. And these are people who play a role that's very similar to an assistant principal. And so there was one of those roles at each of the 2 middle schools. And so what we're doing is combining those 2 roles into a single position. So instead of having 2 employees, we now have 1 employee. And in this assistant principal role, Mr. Harrigan will work more days in the school year. So he'll work at both buildings. So I think that'll be a challenge, and he'll give us more time, which will be a benefit to us because he's a terrific employee and we'll have a lot to contribute, and getting a little more time out of him will be good for us. But it is a reduction overall in 1 administrator.
Great, thank you.
Are there any other questions? Okay, all in favor? Opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, Mr. Harrigan, we wish you lots of luck, happiness, and success with your new position. We're very proud of you, and we're very happy for both schools because they have the benefit of your experience and leadership. So good luck to you. A3 is the appointment of Christopher Myers as the summer school principal for 2020. May I have a motion, please? Ms. Parker, seconded by Mr. Gershon. Are there any questions? All in, Chris DiFilippo, you have a question?
Yes, if we don't have the summer school, will we still have to pay this salary?
A lot of the work of summer school occurs before summer school starts. So part of the reason why we have a need to make this appointment now is so that we can start getting the planning underway. So part of what we have to do is we have to hire the staff for summer school, and that clearly that all happens long before summer school starts. So if for some reason summer school doesn't occur, we would likely have paid for the work that is done prior to summer school, but not necessarily all of summer school. But it seems unlikely to me that there won't be a summer school. I think it's just a question of whether it's going to be an online summer school or an in-person summer school. And so if anything, this year's planning process is going to be doubly challenging because I think we're going to have to simultaneously plan both different types and then see what the rules end up being. But we're going to have to be agile enough that we can do either. So I think Mr. Myers is going to really earn his keep this year.
Well, what happens if the governor determines they want all the students to go to school this summer? So that's going to change things.
Undoubtedly, if the governor orders us to have school in the summer, I think changing the summer school principal will be the least of our worries.
Are there any other questions? Okay, all in favor? Opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, good luck to you, Mr. Myers, and congratulations. A4 is the approval of additional pay for coaches. May I have a motion, please? Ms. Parker, seconded by Ms. Levitan. Are there any questions? All in favor? Opposed? Any abstentions? A5 is the approval of a Section 75 charge. May I have a motion, please? Ms. Chang, seconded by Mr. Ulrich. Are there any questions? All in favor? Opposed? Any abstentions? A6 is the acceptance of resignation of a member of the instructional staff dated April 21st, 2020, effective June 30th, 2020. May I have a motion, please? Mr. DiFilippo, seconded by Ms. Chang. Are there any questions? All in favor? Opposed? Any abstentions? B1 is the approval of recommendations from the Committee on Special Education. May I have a motion, please? Mr. Rotolo, seconded by Ms. Parker. Are there any questions? All in favor? Opposed? Any abstentions? B2 is the approval of recommendations from the Committee on Preschool Special Education. May I have a motion, please? Mr. Feldman, seconded by Mr. Gershon. Are there any questions? All in favor? Opposed? Any abstentions? B3 is the approval of student club charters. May I have a motion, please? Mr. Ulrich, seconded by Ms. Levitan. Are there any questions? All in favor? Opposed? Any abstentions? C1 is the authorization for service contracts. May I have a motion, please? Mr. Feldman, seconded by Ms. Parker. Are there any questions? All in favor? Opposed? Any abstentions? C2 is the authorization for special education and or nursing contracts. May I have a motion, please? Mr. DiFilippo, seconded by Ms. Chang. Are there any questions? All in favor? Opposed? Any abstentions? C3 is the authorization to participate in the Nassau County Consortium for Transportation Services. May I have a motion, please? Ms. Parker, seconded by Mr. Feldman. Are there any questions? Mr. DiFilippo?
Yes, by us participating in this, does this just give us an option to participate in this consortium? Or it doesn't preclude us from, if we decide to have our own RFP, right?
That's correct. And
Okay.
typically what happens is there are efficiencies that can be created through out-of-district transportation routes. So an example would be if I have a kid, if Syosset has a kid going to Chaminade and Jericho has a kid going to Chaminade, rather than us each run our own bus to Chaminade, the Syosset bus can stop in Jericho on its way to Mineola. And it's hard for us to do that independently, but through this consortium, what the consortium does is they hire a consultant. The consultant figures out a bunch of routes that get efficiencies by doing multiple districts simultaneously. And then what they do is they go out and bid out those routes, those efficient routes. So it's a more efficient way of doing transportation than us doing it on our own, because we would have a bunch of these onesie routes.
Okay.
Are there any other questions? All in favor? Opposed? Any abstentions? C4 is the authorization to participate in a cooperative purchasing. May I have a motion, please? Mr. Rotolo, seconded by Ms. Parker. Are there any questions? All in favor? Opposed? Any abstentions? C5 is the approval of intermunicipal cooperative agreement. May I have a motion, please? Mr. Rotolo, seconded by Ms. Chang. Are there any questions? All in favor? Opposed? Any abstentions? C6 through C9 can be taken together. They are the authorization for reductions in change orders. May I have a motion, please? Mr. Ulrich, seconded by Ms. Parker. Are there any questions? All in favor? Opposed? Any abstentions? C10 is the authorization for a change order for site improvements and electrical upgrades at Syosset High School. May I have a motion, please? Mr. Gershon, seconded by Mr. Feldman. Are there any questions? All in favor? Opposed? Any abstentions? C11 is the authorization to reject a bid for sheet music. May I have a motion, please? Ms. Parker, seconded by Mr. Ulrich. Are there any questions? All in favor? Opposed? Any abstentions? C12 is the award of bid for musical instruments. May I have a motion, please? Ms. Levitan, seconded by Mr. Gershon. Are there any questions?
Just a quick question.
Yes.
Are these instruments for next school year? Or are these instruments already purchased or leased for this year that we're concluding?
I'm going
And
to
if
have
we don't have class, God forbid.
Dr. Rufo, are you aware of that? The purchasing of musical instruments resolution, is that for this current year, or is that resolution for purchase for the fall?
Sorry, that is for 1920 for this school year.
Okay, thank you.
All in favor? Opposed? Any abstentions? C13 and 14 can be taken together. They are the authorizations for award of bids for general construction work at Bayless Elementary School and Southwoods Middle School. May I have a motion, please? Mr. Feldman, seconded by Ms. Parker. Are there any questions? All in favor? Opposed? Any abstentions? C15 is the approval of the disposal of broken surplus and or obsolete equipment and books. May I have a motion, please? Ms. Chang, seconded by Ms. Levitan. Are there any questions? All in favor? Opposed? Any abstentions? C16 is the tax anticipation note resolution authorizing the issuance of tax anticipation notes not to exceed $20 million in anticipation of the receipt of taxes to be levied for the fiscal year ending June 30th, 2020, and tax anticipation notes not to exceed $40 million in anticipation of the receipt of taxes to be levied for the fiscal year ending June 30, 2021. May I have a motion, please? Mr. Ulrich, seconded by Ms. Parker. Are there any questions?
Yes, I have a quick question.
Yes, go ahead, Tom.
So if for the origination fee and the interest, do we get reimbursed for that once we receive the money in the leg, or is that on us to incur those costs of floating the note and the interest rate on it? especially the origination fees.
Dr. Rufo? Dr. Rufo? You have to
Muting.
unmute
I'm
yourself. Thank
unmuting.
you.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we do incur those
Yeah, roll
costs.
call.
Yes.
No.
Origination fees, etc. Yes. All of the costs associated with the borrowings.
And since it's not our, we can't get reimbursed for any of these by the state or?
I'm not aware of anything at the current time that suggests that, but it's certainly something, as this is affecting quite a number of districts. If we do need to go through with the TANs for this year, something we can look into.
Thank you.
Raising it at our level, at the level of our organizations.
Were there any other questions? Chris
Yes.
Filippo?
Yeah, yeah, Dr. Rufo, do we have an idea when this money would be? This would be the maximum amount to borrow, but if we borrowed 40 million, when would we pay it back?
The 40 million is for the next year, 2021, and the TANs are typically due on June 30th.
Okay, so they would come due on the 30th?
The one for 40, typically when we borrow and use a TAN, we borrow in the beginning of the fiscal year and then we pay it back by June 30th.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions? Chris Ulrich?
And do we always borrow the full amount, or is it more akin to a line of credit where we could take up to 40 million, but we realize, we need 24 and we just take the 24?
Yes, these are up to amounts and they have to be substantiated through bond counsel and our fiscal advisors with a cash flow. You can't take more than you need. You have to be able to show in your cash flow and defend sort of the low point. So yes, the short answer is yes, these are up to amounts.
So it's up to
Only
40,
borrow what we need.
but we may only take 14 or 17 or 22, depending on the situation.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
that-
what do you anticipate our cost of borrowing would be? What would be our additional cost for this?
The interest rates, I mean, again, things are fluctuating, are looking at 2%. I mean, the last TANs we did was slightly under that. So, but that's the interest rate that we're looking at.
Okay, thank you.
And we might not exercise it at all should the tax funds be there.
Correct.
So this is more of a safety net.
Exactly.
Dr. Rogers, did you have something that you wanted to say?
No, I was just going to comment that Dr. Rufo's point about having to substantiate the need came out of a worry on the state's part that districts at one point in time used to arbitrage funds. They would borrow more than they needed, earn interest on the funds, and then pay the funds back. And the state didn't want school districts doing arbitrage. So all of those rules were put in place and they're fairly strict. So we cannot borrow without substantiating the need.
Okay, this is going to be a roll call vote. So I will speak your names and then you can vote yay or nay, please. Ms. Frankel, yes. Mr. Gershon? Everybody, please unmute when you're about to speak, okay? Mr. Gershon?
Yes.
Ms. Chang?
Yes.
Mr. DiFilippo?
Yes.
Mr. Feldman?
Yes.
Ms. Levitan?
Yes.
Ms. Parker?
Yes.
Mr. Rotolo?
Yes.
Mr. Ulrich?
Yes.
Okay. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you all and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good
Bye.
night.
Be safe and healthy.